As we're working with functions in calculus, we'll always need to be able to determine the domain and range of the function that we're dealing with. So at the end of this lesson, you'll be able to find the domain and range of a function. First of all, the domain of a function is just the set of all real numbers for which the equation is defined. To find the domain, generally I put the equation in y equals form if you can, and then you're just going to ask yourself the question, what can or can't x be? Just a few places that you'll want to be looking for. If I have a square root in the problem, I know that I can never have a negative number underneath the square root because square root is undefined for all negative numbers. Also, if I have any sort of fraction going on in my problem, let's say I have 1 over x or anything like that, I know that the numerator of the denominator of that fraction can never equal 0. So those are a couple of my tricky spots. Other than that, you really don't have too many domain issues. The range of a function is just the set of all real numbers the equation can equal. So basically you're going to be looking for with that is once I put in all the different x's that I can put in, what types of answers will we get for an answer? So here are a couple examples. It says to sketch a graph of the function and find its domain and range. I'm going to try to work these problems a couple different ways so that you can see what's going on. First of all, if I have the graph 4 over x, I'm already familiar with that 4 over x looks like this. And if I'm looking for the domain of this function, I could look at this in a couple different ways. I notice if I'm looking at this equation, is there anything that x can't be? And I do notice a fraction, so would there be anything that would make that the denominator equal 0, and that would be x equals 0. So I know that x can't be 0, and if I look at the graph, if I'm looking at my x values, I notice that I pretty much on the graph have all x values except there's nothing happening at x equals 0. So the domain is all the numbers except x equals 0. So the way that we're going to write that in calculus is we're going to use bracket notation. It's kind of intervals. The domain is going to start with the numbers starting at negative infinity. It has to stop when I get to 0. And notice that I'm going to put in open or a parenthesis showing that I'm not including 0 in my domain. I can pick it up again right after 0 and it will continue all the way to infinity. So that would be the domain of my function. And again, my parentheses would show that I'm not including 0, but I'm including all the other points. Okay, if I'm looking at my range, I will look on here. I'll notice that I'll never get an answer that's 0 because the only way that I could get an answer of 0 was if this said 0 divided by something, which it's always going to say 4, so it can't equal 0. And then once again, if I look at my graph, if I look at the y values, I have y values on my function, but I never have a y value of 0. So the range answer is going to actually look exactly like the domain answer. And so there we go for the domain and the range. All right, for the second one, if I have the square root of 4 minus x squared, this one's actually going to look like the top half of a circle. And if you use your graphing calculator, you could probably figure that out as well. And so if I'm looking at the domain of this one, I'm looking for the x values. Like what x values could I plug in? Notice there's nothing on the graph before -2, and there's nothing on the graph after +2. So my x values can range anywhere from -2 to 2. Okay, notice this time I used brackets because -2 is a point on the graph. You can plug in -2 and you can plug in 2. So the brackets show that yes, I'm including those in the domain of the function. Right, and if I'm looking at the range is what y values or what answers can I get, and you'll notice if I look at it, I have all y values starting at 0 going up to 2. There are no negative values down here. So it starts at 0, and notice 0 is in the range because it is on the graph, so it's going to go from 0 up to 2. We never get a y value that's bigger than 2, but we do get a y value of 2. So again, notice I'm including 0 and 2 in my range. So now you should know how to find the domain and range of a function.